Hey guys, today I wanted to do a kind of impromptu video about a topic that I'm fairly passionate about, that means something to me. The topic is self-harm, and I want to just like preface this by saying, that I don't encourage self-harm. This isn't a pro self-harm video, but at the same time, I also want to say that this is not an anti-self-harm video, in the sense that I'm not just here to, vilify people who engage in such behavior. Self-harm is, I would consider, a widely misunderstood topic. I think that there's a lot of ignorance surrounding it, and there's a lot of judgment, there's a lot of shame, and generally I think it's a topic that needs more awareness brought to it. Something I wanted to establish is that, self-harm is a coping mechanism, not necessarily a positive one, but it can be compared to substance abuse and other addictive behaviors. It has a lot more stigma surrounding it because a lot of people just don't understand it. It seems to be contradictory toward survival instinct on the surface, because you have someone who is hurting themselves intentionally, and a lot of people don't understand how that can help them cope. And once again, I'm not encouraging people to self-harm here, but I'm saying that in reality, it does help people cope. I mean, of course it has consequences, negative consequences, but that being said, it still is a coping mechanism. So like I said, on the surface, it seems to go against survival instinct, but I would in fact argue that it is a method of survival instinct, in the sense that when you're experiencing things as a product of trauma, mental illness, or even just stress, people find ways to cope with that difficulty, that suffering in their lives. And a lot of people will find healthy ways, a lot of people will find unhealthy ways. And even though self-harm is the process of literally damaging one's body, I think that it is a way of the brain finding a coping mechanism, not necessarily a very healthy one, but finding a coping mechanism nonetheless to deal with things that make it difficult to survive, So in that sense, I think it's part of the survival instinct. So I think there's a lot of myths surrounding self-harm, or not myths, but misunderstandings. A lot of people think of it as like something that teenage girls do for attention. I think that's a pretty harmful rhetoric, because there are many adults of all genders who engage in self-harm. So I think that stereotype is damaging in multiple ways. I mean, with teenage girls who do self-harm, it shames them. And then on the other hand, you have adults and people who are not teenage girls who self-harm, and that invalidates them, or it shames them as well, because it's implying that it's some sort of childish behavior. I think there's many ways that, I don't want to say society, but there are many ways that people who are ignorant of self-harm unintentionally shame people who engage in it. And I think as a consequence of that, it makes it difficult for people who engage in self-harm to seek help, whether it's with a peer or a loved one or whatever. And that help can be the difference between life or death in some cases. There are generally things that are causing the behavior of self-harm. It's not in a vacuum. And having all the shame and stigma surrounding it makes it scary for someone who self-harms to talk to someone about it, for fear of judgment, for fear of ostracization, and many other social dynamics that play into that aspect of shame and stigma. I mean, I've experienced this personally. Like, I started self-harming when I was about 12. I've been clean for 2 years now. So when I was in middle school and high school, which was probably about maybe 2008 to 2014-ish, I was going through some shit, and I used self-harm as a negative coping mechanism. And trying to open up about it cost me relationships, as in relationships with friends. I don't know exactly how the landscape is now surrounding how kids perceive self-harm, but when I was in school, it was greatly shamed, and I made efforts to hide it, of course, from my peers and my parents and the school staff. But when I did try and confide with people, one of them reported me to a counselor, which is, that's okay. I mean, I needed help, obviously, and they wanted me to get help. So at the time, I was pissed off. But then after that, they kind of just, they stopped associating with me. It just felt like they viewed me with some sort of sense of disgust. And I had another friend who, after I confided in him that I self-harmed and didn't know like what to do about it, he just essentially cut me off. Like, he stopped talking to me. I mean, we used to hang out after school and play video games and stuff, and he just kind of stonewalled me and stopped being friends with me over that. Those types of experiences build a reinforcement of that shame and of that fear to reach out to people, because you're afraid you might lose or damage relationships. You're afraid you might be judged or punished, or whatever it may be. So I didn't end up getting treatment for it until I was probably about 19 or 20. I don't want to speak for other people's experiences, because I just have my own, but I imagine that a lot of people have gone through similar experiences. And I feel like for me and for other people, if there was more education and awareness brought about regarding self-harm, then maybe instances like that wouldn't happen, or they would be less common, and maybe people would be more comfortable coming forward and seeking help and getting help earlier before it's more difficult to quit. And that kind of leads into another point I wanted to make, that self-harm can be a very addictive habit. I used to frequent forums online that were dedicated towards people who were trying to get clean from self-harm. And I say clean because in many people's experiences, it's like a drug. Many people who self-harm think, I'm a freak. What I'm doing is wrong or bad or disgusting, or, all these. I mean, I'm not saying that self-harm isn't bad here or whatever, but it's incredibly important to view it in the lens of compassion and empathy. Someone self-harming doesn't make them a bad person. I used to think that I was a freak. I used to think that I was a weirdo, and that sort of thing. There was a lot of internalized shame there because I didn't understand why I was doing what I was doing. But when I started learning about pharmacology and chemistry and stuff, I began to realize that something that I thought was so irrational and hard to understand began to make more sense to me. I mean, when the body experiences a painful stimuli, it triggers the release of peptide hormones called endorphins, among other neurotransmitters. And endorphins bind and activate the mu-opioid receptors, which are implicated in opioid addiction, withdrawal, and the euphoric sensations provided by the opioids. Just that aspect alone, I mean, self-harm is literally addictive. At a certain point, you're reinforcing the creation of new pathways in your brain that strengthen this behavioral impulse. And you're also affecting your neurochemistry. So chronic activation of these receptors triggers downstream effects that cause the epigenetic regulation of these receptor types on the neuron. If you have a receptor being activated too often, it will generally trigger downstream pathways that result in changes in the rate at which it is transcribed by DNA. And that causes less of these receptors to be produced by the ribosomes and less of them to populate the postsynaptic neuronal membrane. And that means that you need more of the stimuli, more of this endogenous hormone for you to have the same effects, because you have less of those receptors present, what's called downregulation of these receptors. And so you begin to feel cravings, compulsions to do it more. Because then when you don't have any stimuli there's less receptors for the natural endogenous hormones to bind to, and this creates withdrawal-like symptoms because of this imbalance. But I thought it was important to talk about the neurological effects that self-harm has, because people think, like, why do I do this? It just feels right, but why do I do this? And it's not some magical evil thing that's being manifested, it's the brain trying to cope with difficult circumstances, emotions, etc. And it's one of many ways that it can do so. And that behavior becomes reinforced and propagated, and it can become addictive. I self-harmed for about 12 or 13 years before I quit. And I still think of it like it's a drug, If I'm feeling some type of way, sometimes I still think about it like it's an option. But I've learned to deal with those emotions in a less negative way. And I don't know, I just wanted to talk about this because it was such a dominant aspect of my life for a long time that affected me in my interpersonal relationships in many ways. And I know that it's fairly pervasive these days. I feel like there's been some progress forward towards a more compassionate approach to it, but at the same time, I still think there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding, and I think that it would be incredibly positive and helpful for those who are going through difficult circumstances to not be afraid to talk about their problems and to talk about how they cope. I wish that it was less stigmatized and less shamed, and there was less disgust, and that way I think a lot more people would feel comfortable seeking help, finding a healthier coping mechanism before they go too deep down the rabbit hole. Because the longer you do it, the more reinforced it is and the more difficult it is to quit. It was really difficult for me to quit. And I'm not trying to like soapbox here or whatever, but like if you self-harm, I just want to let you know that it doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you evil or disgusting or whatever. If you have scars and you used to self-harm, they don't make you ugly. I have a lot of scars and I don't hide them anymore. And I get stares, and I used to get some comments and stuff, but like, fuck those people. It's easy to say. I know a lot of people hide their scars, but it's very freeing to not do so, to be able to just express your true self without feeling like you need to hide it from people for fear of judgment. It was very difficult for me at first when I had more fresh scars, especially, to go into public, because people would stare, people would make comments, and I felt very ashamed and ostracized in a sense, because it felt like I couldn't just live my life without having these people who, some of them may have meant well, or most of them are probably just ignorant, and I don't, like, hate them for that. Ignorance isn't malice. Ignorance is the lack of understanding. And the only way you can cure ignorance is through explanation, through knowledge. But yeah, over the years, I became more comfortable with it, and I learned to just ignore the stares, deal with people who would confront me randomly, like the Bible thumpers and stuff. I've had so many religious people come and be like, "Hey, how's it going?" And I'm like, "Hey, I'm good. How are you doing?" And they're like, "Have you heard the good word of Jesus?" And I'm like, "Fuck." Like, here for a second, I thought you actually wanted to have a genuine, like, interaction with me. I mean, I guess in their minds it is a genuine interaction, but I don't think that proselytizing is helpful either. I'm not some like lost lamb that needs a shepherd. I'm someone who has dealt a bad hand and who coped with it. And that way wasn't very healthy, but it was what it was, and now it is what it is, and I've learned better mechanisms. And so I just wanted to say that if you struggle with self-harm, this is difficult to say because I know how it probably sounds to someone who's currently self-harming. Like, you know, fuck this dude. Like, self-harming helps me. I know it's bad. I mean, a lot of people are very aware that, you know, purposely injuring yourself isn't the healthiest thing to do. As someone who used to self-harm, I grew very tired of people's sympathy, of people's sappy comments and stuff. So I don't like coming across like that, you know. But I just wanted to say, like, truly, I believe, as someone who's experienced this, that no matter how long you've been self-harming, it is possible to quit. I feel like I'm sounding kind of corny here because, you know, I feel like the person who would talk to me like 5 years ago when I was still hurting myself, and who would be like, oh, you know, like, it's possible to quit, you're still beautiful, you know, like all that shit. And when you're in the moment, it really does feel like placation, like patronization, you know, like someone's treating you like a child. I'm not trying to do that. It's just something that I really wanted to discuss because it means a lot to me. And I know there's a lot of people out there struggling. It takes different forms for different people, and how it manifests outside of their mind. But just to reiterate, you know, if you self-harm, you're not a freak. What you're doing isn't wrong, in the sense that it is a logical response to a difficult situation or difficult circumstance. Not, once again, not glorifying it here. I'm not saying that it's a good thing to do. I don't like using good and bad, actually. Like, good and bad has connotations with it. I like to say healthy and unhealthy, because, you know, like wrong or right, you know, good, bad, that's very binary, and I don't think it's very productive to use that kind of terminology with issues like this. So I like to say healthy or unhealthy. And I know I'm kind of rambling at this point. I hope this video was not too tangential, but I wanted to say that, you know, if you don't understand self-harm and you don't do it, I'd highly recommend educating yourself about it and trying to put yourself in other people's shoes and compare it to your own experience. You know, everyone copes in some way. People cope in different ways, but you know, the underlying mechanism is the same, and you can, even if your coping mechanisms are vastly different, you can still empathize and you can still relate to someone, and doing so can be very helpful to someone in a rough place. And to people who do self-harm, I just wanted to say that it doesn't make you a freak, it doesn't make you a weirdo, it doesn't make you any less beautiful as a person, as an individual. If you do self-harm, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to someone you trust, a loved one, a friend who you trust. There are places online like r/self-harm, the Reddit subreddit, where you can receive anonymous peer support, and there's other avenues that you can pursue, you know, call lines and stuff like that. But peer support can be very important, and substitution with a better coping mechanism can also be very important. And I just wanted to say that it is possible for you to replace this coping mechanism with another one, and not because this coping mechanism makes you a bad person or anything, but because it's unhealthy for you. And a lot of people probably don't care about that, you know, when you're self-harming, and if you're having like suicidal ideations or depression, you don't care about yourself. And so it's hard to seek help because you think, like, well, who cares if it's harming myself? Who cares if it's an unhealthy mechanism? I don't care. I'm not going to be around for, you know, very long, or whatever the case is. This is just the state of mind that some people find themselves in, which I completely empathize with and understand. And not everyone is ready to change. I wasn't ready to change for 12 years, but eventually I got to the point where I wanted to quit. And you know, you gotta want to in order to do it. Otherwise, it's just not gonna happen, really. So I just want to say to anyone who doesn't care about themselves, who hates themselves, who want to kill themselves, which I've personally experienced in the past for a long time. I know that any platitudes aren't gonna change the way you feel about yourself, but I like to just say that feelings are temporary. You know, they may last a decade, like in my case, especially patterns of feelings and reinforced behaviors and feelings associated with them, but they're temporary, you know. The way you're feeling now doesn't define the way you will feel forever, and someday you might get to a point where you're doing better and you would like to find a healthier way to deal with these negative emotions. And like I was saying, you know, it's not permanent. And if you can last until you see that light, I'm really sounding like a Jesus freak here right now, but I don't mean to. If you can just make it until the paradigm changes, then life will become much more enjoyable and tolerable to you, and you may actually feel at some point in the future that it's worth living. I highly encourage anyone who's struggling to try and, you know, stick it out. And I know it's hard. It can be really hard, and like I said, it can be helpful to talk to peers and such, but in the end it's about sticking it out and trying to get to that better tomorrow. And to people who are trying to quit self-harm actively, I wanted to say that, you know, relapses don't negate progress. I think that relapsing is a natural part of recovery, and I know from my experience on the r/self-harm subreddit, of which I was pretty active in for a long time, a lot of people tend to denigrate themselves, to shame themselves for relapsing, and a lot of people feel like it sets them back to square one, but I don't think that's true. I think that I think of it more like as a road bump, you know, or a pothole or something. Like, you might get caught up a little bit, but you can keep going. It doesn't negate all the progress you made. And if you can keep going longer and longer in between relapses, then that's huge. Like any amount of time clean from self-harm, like, good fucking job. I know how it, I keep saying I know it's different for everyone, and I'm not trying to act like I know how everyone feels and all that, but I know how I feel and how I felt. And for me personally, it was very helpful to try and view it, like, actively try and think of it as not so binary. Like, relapses are part of a bigger picture, and that's recovery, and any time in between those relapses is a huge accomplishment that it's hard to feel proud of when you're going through it. If I hear that someone is like a day clean from self-harm, a week clean, a month, a year, you know, they're all huge accomplishments in my mind, because I understand how difficult it is to shake such a deeply ingrained coping mechanism. So even if you've only gone a day without self-harming, or an hour, you know, I'm proud of you. If you've gone 2 years, I'm proud of you. If you relapsed, I'm not proud of you for relapsing, but I'm proud of you for sticking with the journey of recovery. And even if you relapse and then go back into recurrent self-harm, eventually that may end, and then you'll get back on the road. And I'm proud of anyone who's out there traveling that road, because it's difficult. And to the people who don't want to quit self-harm, I'm proud of you for hanging in there, for being alive. Because people underestimate how difficult it can be to stay alive sometimes, And self-harm is not an ideal coping mechanism, but you're surviving, like that's tough. That's tough to do, regardless. And I'm proud of you for sticking in there, even though shit sucks. Even though you may have gone through horrible things that were out of your control, or maybe if you're dealing with certain physiological or mental, which I would include in physiological conditions, you're still here, and that's saying something. I'm new to YouTube, so I don't know if this is like kosher to talk about, but if anyone has like committed suicide, I'm proud of them for making it as long as they did, because it's fucking difficult. And I just wish that those people could have gotten more support, more help, and could have maybe been given the resources and tools necessary to hang in there a bit longer until things get better. But yeah, this video is getting pretty long at this point, and I feel like I'm kind of just I'm getting a bit sappy here. It's something I really wanted to talk about because it means a lot to me, personally, for my own experiences and experiences with friends of mine and former friends who aren't around anymore. And I hope that I was able to articulate what I wanted to in a comprehensible way, So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I'll catch you guys later, and hang in there, Shit's tough, and I hope it gets better for all of us who may be struggling right now.